So we're going to wait for a little bit more people before we start. And before we start, I'll also throw in a rule of engagement with everyone, so that at least there's a flow of conversation without any disturbance. I'll be waiting for about, let's say, 3 more people. We are expecting about 89 people, but we know that there's a bit of African time in Nigeria, so so that we don't waste time. This session is meant to be for an hour, so we don't have a lot of time to wait for a lot of people. So we'll just wait for 2 more people and then we start. Is that fine by everybody? You can send a message in the chat if you are okay with the plan. Yeah, so everyone seems okay with the plan. Yeah, so we can start. So the rule of engagement before we start is that please all your mics should be muted so that we don't disturb the flow of conversation. If you have any questions at all, at the end of the session, our speaker will be answering all our questions. So in between the session, if you know you cannot remember your questions you want to ask, you can send it to the chat so that we have it recorded so that then we can take the questions later. And that will be all the rule of engagement for today. Thank you very much for joining, Ephraim. Thank you, Oluchi. I'm very excited for this. So we're going to be talking majorly about psychological first aid for coping together after tragedy, and we may reference some issues that we faced or some problems that we faced recently in Nigeria. For example, the Owo attack that happened recently. And Emergency Response Africa will be working with Avi Tenenbaum. Yeah. So I want to share a little bit of what Emergency Response Africa is about, what we do, why we do what we do, and then I will also introduce Avi to take and speak with us. Emergency Response Africa is building the largest network of first responders, emergency vehicles and verified hospitals across Nigeria. And how we're able to do that is that we are connecting emergency victims to help by using technology. So what that means is as soon as you call us, we are going to provide an end-to-end service. It means that from the time of the call to the time we take you to the hospital, you are probably taken care of. So that means that from the other side of the phone, somebody will give you what we call phone first aid prior to a first responder getting to you or the ambulance coming to pick you to the nearest, most appropriate hospital. And how we're able to do this is firstly, so there's the first one request that is end-to-end care. So either you call us through our toll-free number or you use our mobile application to reach out to us. Currently, we have the fastest response time in Lagos and Abuja and a little bit of Port Harcourt too. And what that means is that we have what we call community first responders that will actually get to you in time with our motorcycles and also our ambulances. And of course, we have lower cost of care. So from triage-based treatment to treat-based treatment by subscription, we are able to allow people afford our services. And how we do this is an infographic. A bystander reaches out to us either through our toll-free number or request via our application. A responder gets there under 20 minutes, even up to 10 minutes sometimes, or even less. Although our goal is to reach all over Africa 10 minutes or less, but currently what we are trying to work on is 20 minutes. The motorcycle-based approach. They treat on site, and if there's a need to move the person to the hospital, an ambulance then takes the person to the hospital. Currently, we are in 3 states. We're in Abuja, Lagos, and Port Harcourt, Nigeria. We plan to expand to other parts of the country very soon, and in the coming years, expand to some countries in Africa. We've gotten a lot of testimonials. One of it is from Dr. Belinda Inwosu, that had a senior brother, an emergency, a renal emergency, which is kidney, and then we had to take care of. What we do normally is we provide unlimited access to our 24/7 call center. We also treat on site and with ambulance evacuation to a verified hospital. We provide first aid training. We believe that health literacy is important in alleviating any problem or any healthcare problem in a population. So we provide first aid training and certification. We also provide first aid tools like first aid kits and so on and so forth. We practice simulation, so we manage practice simulations. and also we provide ambulance for events. So we station our ambulance for events. This is our toll-free number. God forbid is not alone. It's not enough. You also need to take actions. We also have our mobile application, which is Signal by Era. You can get it on Google Play or iPhone. That's Apple Store. Yeah, so I'd like to introduce our speaker. His name is Avi Tenenbaum. He's an expert in disaster behavioral health and psychological first aid. He provides international training to mental health and medical professionals, first responders, and the general public in psychological disaster response and grief leadership. Please, I would like everyone to, with a resounding applause, invite our speaker so that he can take the stage. I'll also stop sharing my screen now so that I can give him access for him to also share his screen. Thank you very much for your time so far.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And before I share my screen, I'd like to say to all the fans and followers of this organization, it's inspiring for me to see the amazing things that they're doing. I've never been to your country. I had a chance to learn about your country over the last few days, and what you're doing is incredible. I was in Johannesburg a few years ago to do a training, and I understand the great importance in Africa of having such an organization like this one. It's much more critical. It saves lives. It's really something else. And I've been following the work of your organization for about 2-3 years now. I'm on your mailing list, and I just feel energy every time I see a new course that you're opening up, new people that you're training, a new update. And it's just a group of great people doing amazing things. So thank you for what you're doing for your country and for the world. You're a good example for what people should do when you're leading the way. So that's the first thing I want to say. So thank you for your work. And the second thing I want to say is, unfortunately, we're meeting here in difficult times. I understand that Nigeria, not a long time ago, had a terrible stampede. And then after the stampede, now we had this attack, which is unspeakable. And we're going to be talking now for the next hour or so about what feelings come up for us during and after difficult circumstances like these, and how to give a name for what we're feeling, and maybe to see what we can do about the feelings. Maybe by learning this, we can help ourselves if we're having some difficulty, and maybe we can be helpful to somebody else. And this is also going to be recorded. And so once something is recorded, if you think you have a friend that will benefit from the information tonight, you can share it with those people. You can send it out. Maybe the different communities and families who are affected by what happened can benefit from some of the ideas. And our hearts go out to the victims, and it's really unspeakable. So with that introduction, I'm going to share my screen and show you the presentation that we made for tonight. So first of all, I'm grateful that we're coming together tonight. And I think the very fact that we come together after difficult times, even if all we did was drink tea together, it has a lot of power to it, because we grow as a people. We help one another during difficult times. In psychological language, sometimes we call this co-regulation. When I'm with you, you help me feel good. I help you feel good. You give me strength. I give you strength. And there's a lot of power to people in a community coming together after difficult times. And that's what we're doing now. By coming together for such a Zoom, we're also validating that trauma exists. In other words, after a terrible tragedy like this, so of course we need ambulances and doctors, surgeons, because people are physically wounded. But tonight, by getting together, we are recognizing the importance of psychological trauma, the way that we are impacted in our minds and in our feelings after such an event. So I tried to tailor the ideas a little bit to the recent events in your country. Every tragedy, every difficult event like these are unique. Every culture is unique. Every country is unique. And there's going to be unique features, unique parts of every story. So I don't give the same zoom by every time something happens. It's really different each time. But one of the things we find in common after difficult shootings, stampedes, mass casualties, one of the things we find is that such an event affects people on many different levels. In other words, we might know somebody that died in one of these events. Maybe somebody was killed in the church attack. Maybe it was somebody that we love. Maybe we don't know anybody there and it still affects us in some way. Maybe by just hearing about it, we're afraid now to go to places of worship because we feel unsafe. Maybe we're a third cousin of somebody that died in an attack. And so many people can be affected in such a trauma event in many ways. And you can call it a psychological footprint. In other words, it's true that the shooting happened in this town and the stampede happened in that town, but it happened in our country. It happens to our community. It happens to people similar to us. And it affects us. And it affects people around the world too. So there might be people who heard about this event, even in another country, and now they're thinking twice about going outside. They're worried when they go to sleep if they're safe. It really can affect people in many ways. So each person is going to be affected by the sad events that happened in a different way. And then there's a timeline of how these trauma events usually play out. So these are just some psychological concepts. What they're basically saying is that after traumatic events happen, we feel shocked, we feel sad, we feel depressed, we feel angry, and any feeling you can think of. And this is our initial reaction to trauma. And in the world of psychology, that's called acute stress reaction. Something bad happens and we react. We can't sleep, we can't eat, we're confused. We feel that trauma in our body. This is how human beings like you and me react to sad things, shocking things, traumatic things. Generally speaking, 3 days or 4 days after an event as bad as the ones we're coming to talk about, usually people start to feel a reduction in what they're feeling. In other words, right after the event, they feel terrible. Maybe they don't feel terrible, but if they do feel terrible, they usually will feel a little bit of relief as the time goes on. A day later, 2 days later, they're going to start feeling a little bit of relief. 4 days later, the initial shock of the traumatic event wears off. But that's not necessarily true for everybody. And so some people might still feel a lot of difficulty, a lot of sadness from 3 days after the event, even until 30 days later. And that's common as well. That's a different category. In the world of psychology, we would call that acute stress disorder. And all that really means is we got shocked and traumatized after the initial event, and we have different symptoms of trauma, of psychological trauma, and they're still with us a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We're having this very significant difficulty. And then post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is if the person still has that difficulty even a month after the event, even a year, 10 years, 20 years. In fact, today, one of my colleagues told me about a person who was raped, a man who was raped as a child. And so he has sexual trauma, and now he's in his 40s, and he still has post-traumatic stress disorder. And so once a person's trauma lasts for that long, for 30 days later, it can last for many years if we don't do something about it, if we don't treat it, if we don't intervene. Okay, so all we're saying is that it's normal for human beings to show up to a traumatic event and to feel really shocked, really sad, and various symptoms of trauma. But generally that will diminish over time. And for most people, it will diminish, and for some people that will stay. Okay? Here's an example. My uncle was killed today. A person whose uncle was killed today is going to feel different than somebody whose uncle was killed last week, somebody whose uncle was killed last month, or their uncle was killed 5 years ago. By most people, as time goes on, they'll feel some relief. Now, what we're saying from this is that it's normal for us to feel very upset and disturbed after a traumatic event, but it's quite normal. There's an expression that we say when we do this type of work, that it's a normal reaction for an abnormal situation. When we see such terrible things, we hear such terrible news on the internet, we see footage, we hear stories, maybe we know somebody that was hurt, injured, killed, maybe we know first responders who were involved in saving some of the lives there. This shakes us up, it hurts us, it's hard for us. And that's normal. That's not considered a mental health issue. But if that stays for a long time and we're having difficulty, that's when it starts to become an issue that deserves some unique attention. So what do we do after a situation like the terrible ones that we're talking about tonight? So there's something called psychological first aid. And, partnering with you guys, with the ERA, you guys do first aid. So you are paramedics, doctors, EMTs, you have motorcycles, you have ambulances, and you do first aid. So you come to a person who broke their leg, somebody who has a heart attack, they fainted, they have a problem with their sugar, that their sugar is too low. And what you do is you come and you give them first aid. And once you give them the initial help, the first aid, you transport them to the hospital. And that's where people who are doctors and surgeons and nurses continue the help. And so psychological first aid is the similar idea, where something terrible just happened, and maybe people need a psychologist, maybe they don't need a psychologist, but at least for right now, let's give them some psychological first aid. Let's give that person or ourselves the initial psychological help to help people who are really suffering, they're in pain, they're broken, they're shocked, to cope and to get through these next few days in a better way. That's the goal of psychological first aid. And psychological first aid is something that anybody can do, especially if you're trained in it. In other words, psychologists do psychology, social workers, they do social work, psychiatrists do psychiatry. But those are all people who are professionals, they're licensed professionals, they went to university. Psychological first aid is something that anybody can do as long as they have the right knowledge and tools. And we can use those tools to help ourselves or our friends. And psychological first aid isn't therapy. The idea of psychological first aid is basically to understand how we might be feeling in the next few days and to do what's called psychoeducation, to understand what might we expect. What is our mood going to be like in the next few days? What are we going to feel like a few weeks from now? And what can we do about it if we're feeling that? How can we cope? How can we get through that better? What if we have, for example, very scary thoughts that aren't leaving us alone? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with not being able to sleep for a few nights or being worried about going outside? The initial shock that we're having, what can we do about that? And so one of the first things we always do in psychological first aid is normalization. And by the way, everybody can receive these slides. So if you want to review this and keep this, you can have this later on to remember what we're discussing. we want to normalize what we're feeling. We want to be understanding that after we hear about 50 people being killed and 100 people being wounded, or 31 people being killed in a stampede, this is upsetting information. This affects our soul. This changes the way our mind feels. This profoundly impacts the way that we think. It's very deep. And just like a person breaks their leg, and that's a real injury, sometimes you don't break your leg, you just sprain your leg, right? And you don't need a cast, but you kind of need to just be careful with how you walk for the next few days. So psychological trauma is the same way. It's the same thing. In fact, I know that a lot of people on the Zoom tonight are medical professionals. So trauma, the word trauma in English, we know means something that was hit by something else, right? Some sort of blunt force came and caused an injury, right? So there's a car accident, somebody fell out of a building, a work accident. So those are trauma, physical trauma incidents. And you take a person to a trauma room and we'll give them blood and we'll do surgery and stitches, right? So psychological trauma is really very similar. It's when an event comes and it's so shocking that it comes and smashes into our perception of the world, our sense of safety, the way that we predict the world's always going to be the same old thing, and all of a sudden this crazy thing happens. And so it's a type of trauma. And so it's quite appropriate that that word is used also in physical injury, and also here. And so one of the things we want to do is normalization. We want to understand for ourselves and be compassionate to ourselves and be compassionate to somebody else that it's normal to feel quite bad after such an event. And people react to traumatic events in many different ways. In fact, I'll tell you a story because stories are a great way to teach things. I do this type of work around the world, but in my volunteer spare time, I also am a medic. And so I go to medical emergencies as well. And there was a suicide of a man here from Ethiopia who lives in my neighborhood. And he died by suicide, a young man. And his family came to the house. And of course, this is a very traumatic event. And the father of the young man, when he heard that his son died by suicide, he started laughing. And he was laughing and laughing as if somebody just told him the funniest joke. And that is a way of dealing and reacting to traumatic news, right? When you're shocked, if I tell you a joke, for example, and I tell you the punchline of the joke, and you didn't expect the punchline, and you start laughing because it's something that was unexpected, it surprised you. This was how the father of the man who was deceased, this is how he reacted to the terrible news of his son not being alive. He started laughing. And so there are many different reactions people have to trauma. People can eat without stopping or not eat at all and have no appetite. They want to be in bed all day or they can't sleep at all. They may have memories or sights, pictures, images of something that they saw themselves as a first responder or something they saw on the news that's not leaving them alone. It keeps sitting in their mind, intrusive thoughts. Person can have hypervigilance, which is like, I'm afraid at any moment that something bad is going to happen, right? So I'm always looking very carefully, afraid at any moment that gunmen are going to come and shoot innocent people. And now we start to walk around very careful. And this is very difficult. It's restricting. We don't want to go outside. We don't want to go to church. We don't want to go shopping. So these are all different ways that people show up to trauma. And what's interesting is that after a traumatic event, some people who are very involved in this event, maybe their uncle died in the attack, they don't feel so sad like they think they should be. Sometimes they'll say, I feel so bad, I feel guilty that I don't feel bad. I feel bad that I don't feel bad. And right? So you have people like that, and they feel apathy, they feel disconnected, they feel dissociated somewhat from the terrible events. You have other people who feel very sad, and they're looking for ways to cope. And so maybe they're playing video games on the computer, and now they feel bad that they're doing something to cope because they felt bad. So you have lots of guilt that comes up when these things happen. You have survivor's guilt, like, I feel bad that I survived the church attack and my uncle did it. And he was a great man, and I'm not such a great person. How come God killed him and not me? It's not fair. So there's all sorts of really interesting ways that we show up to these events. We ask these questions, we feel guilty. And so what we want to tell people tonight is, you have permission to feel whatever you're feeling. You can feel disconnected, you can feel angry, you can feel sad, you can cope and not feel bad that you're playing video games to cope. We'll talk soon about good ways of coping, but if you're doing something to get through the difficult days and that's helpful to you, we don't have to guilt ourselves about that. Some people feel bad that they're sad about an event that they have no connection to. Somebody lives 100 miles away, 500 miles away, or kilometers away from the church attack, and they feel bad and say, why do I even feel bad? My uncle didn't die. No one that I knew died. I must be crazy. And they don't have to feel bad about that either, because as a nation, as a community, and as similar people together, we are touched by these events in many different ways. Maybe somebody watches the news. I was watching the news about these events on YouTube the other day, and I was watching an interview with a father who lost a young child in the stampede. And I felt sad for him because I have children, and I'm hearing a father who's grieving talking about losing a child, and I connect with that. I don't have to be from Nigeria to feel sad and sympathy for him. So I'm just saying that there's a variety of feelings that we have after these events, and it's completely okay. And we have permission to feel those feelings. The next thing that I think is valuable to talk about is there's something called trauma cues or triggers. And what that means is, let's say I start to feel better, and 2 weeks go by, 3 weeks go by, a month goes by, and I'm feeling great. And all of a sudden, I see a soldier walk by with a gun. And that reminds me of the guns that the men used in the church attack. And now I'm feeling trauma all of a sudden. Or I hear lots of ambulances, and I start to feel terror, fear in my heart. Oh my God, there's another attack. And maybe there's no other attack, there's just a house fire or something, right? And these things trigger us, they remind us, they create memories, connections to memories that we have of the things that cause us trauma. Some people who were traumatized by the church attack or the stampede may be afraid now to go into a crowded place. I'll tell you an interesting story. I was speaking to a young man about a month ago who he almost drowned in a boating accident. The boat flipped over, he fell out of his boat, and he almost drowned, and thank God he was able to survive. He had a life jacket on, but his life jacket got stuck to the boat, and he was under the boat, under the water, for about a minute, and this was a terrifying experience, and he was able eventually to pull the life jacket off and to come to the surface of the water and to be safe. And one of the triggers for him was that he couldn't go into an elevator, and that was very scary to him. Now you'll say to yourself, well, what does an elevator have to do with almost drowning? So I asked him that question, and he told me, when I was drowning, I felt like I was pushing to survive. I had no room to move. I was like stuck. I was stuck under the boat. And that experience of being stuck under the boat the elevator, where there's a lot of people in an elevator, reminded me that I'm stuck. And so that was a trigger to the memory of me being underwater. Okay, so we worked on that, and now he's feeling better, thank God. But it's interesting how trauma can work that way. And it can even work this way decades later. In fact, just one other story, because I'm addicted to telling stories. There was a very terrible shooting in the United States, 23 or 24 years ago in Columbine, in the state of Colorado in the United States. Anyways, a girl in a school survived the school shooting 23 or 24 years ago. And 2 decades later, she came to that school to drop her daughter off at the daycare at the school. And suddenly she had terror in her heart. And out of nowhere, from 20 years before, trauma came up for her. So it's interesting how trauma can work that way. Okay, we're making great progress in this talk. So after difficult traumatic events, a lot of times we ask questions. And they may be religious questions, they may be spiritual questions, philosophical questions, existential questions. In other words, questions like, why did this shooting happen? Why did these children have to die? Why did it happen in a holy place, a place of worship? Why does this happen to our country? We try to be such good people. What did we do wrong? And so we find ourselves asking a lot of these questions. Now, if you have a spiritual or religious question, of course, you can ask that to a religious mentor, a guide of yours, a priest or imam or whoever you believe in. But I'm just going to talk about these questions for a moment from the place of trauma. You'll find very often after tragedy that people ask these types of questions as a reaction to trauma. And they're not even looking now for an answer. And you might call that a rhetorical question. It's a question that they're not looking for an answer. They're just looking to express themselves. They're talking in a way that shows that they're shocked, that they're angry. And this is how they're expressing those feelings. Why did this happen? Right? If a bunch of children die and you say to me, why did this happen? And it was 2 days ago. And I say, let me tell you why it happened. And I start opening up the Bible and explaining all sorts of reasons why it happened. You may not want to hear my answer because maybe you're not looking for an answer right now. Maybe right now you're just sharing your feelings. You're feeling very raw, sharp, painful feelings. And this is your way of talking. And if I try to answer you literally, it's not even going to work. It's going to invalidate your feelings. So what I might do is, I would say to you, are you looking for an answer right now, or are you looking to share your feelings? And if you ask that to people, they may say, I'm looking just to share my feelings. Or they may say, I'm looking for an answer. And if you ask them, you'll find out what they're looking for. But these are often the ways that we share that we're completely surprised and shocked about a traumatic event. And this is very, very common. I can't speak for people from other religions, but I know that in some religions, there's an understanding that this is how people show up after difficult events. And it's not considered blasphemy. It's not considered necessarily, somebody might say, oh, I feel so bad. I had this question. How could I not have had faith? But I know that in some religions, from a lot of talks that I've given around the world, there's an understanding from their religious leaders that this is a way that people react. It's not because we're blasphemous. It's not because we don't have faith. We're people of faith, but we're in pain. And this is how we talk in pain. So that's just an interesting thing that may be helpful for somebody to hear. Okay. So we spoke about trauma. We spoke about the way that people show up to traumatic events. And there's a lot more to talk about, but we're trying to just give a summary. What could we do about it? how could we cope with trauma? What do we do about what happened? We're feeling so terrible. We're feeling sad. We're feeling unsafe. Or maybe we know somebody else who's feeling unsafe or they're feeling sad. What do we do? So on the simplest level, and if we have time, maybe we'll go into it more, we're looking for ways to cope. So what that means is, we can't make a bad situation good because it's a terrible tragedy and the lives are lost and there's no way to get those children back. And we have questions of injustice. It's not fair. Why did it happen? And we're angry and we're blaming maybe politicians and we're wondering why there's not enough security. And these are the types of the things that people react to in all these types of situations around the world. It's quite universal. We're not going to make this a happy event. This is not a wedding. This is going to be a tragedy. But we can go through a tragedy a little bit better and a little bit less better. We can take the worst moment of our lives and look for how to go through it a little bit more effectively or not. And that's what we're looking to do. Okay? And again, I'm going to tell a story just to bring out the idea that we're saying. I told you that I'm a medic in my spare time. And the first CPR that I ever did as a medic was on a neighbor of mine in the place that I used to live. It was 2 a.m. and I was still studying to be a medic, but I started to get the information about the calls. And I was allowed at that time to go on a CPR. That was the only call that I was allowed to respond to because I was still a student. And I got information at 2 a.m. that a neighbor of mine went into cardiac arrest. He had a heart attack. He was 70 years old. He had cancer. Very nice man. And I ran downstairs. And of course, I was the first medic to arrive on scene because I'm the neighbor, right? And I started doing CPR. And after about 3 or 4 minutes, a bunch of my colleagues came and they start to continue the CPR. They're doing chest compressions. They're opening up an IV to give adrenaline. They're putting on a defibrillator, et cetera, et cetera. And once the CPR started going in progress, so somebody said, Avi, you help people during difficult times. Go to the kitchen because the patient's wife is in the kitchen and she's crying. Maybe you can help her. I said, okay. I went to the kitchen and the patient's wife of 50 years, they're married for 50 years. She's sitting in the kitchen and she's crying. She doesn't know what's going to happen to her husband. And I'm there with her. And after about 45 minutes to an hour, the patient is declared deceased and there's nothing we can do, right? It happens with most CPRs. The patient is deceased and we're not able to bring them back. Especially here, it was an oncological patient. It was somebody with cancer. They were not well before this. And it was very tragic. And when everybody was done with the CPR, we wrapped up all of our medical gear and everybody went back home to go to sleep. It was already 3:30 in the morning. And somebody said to me the next day, one of my friends who's a medic, he's a good friend of mine. He said, Avi, you must not be good at the job that you do during the day with trauma. You must not do a good job. I said, why do you say that? He says, because you were sitting with this guy's wife. She was crying. And when we left at 3:30 a.m., she was still crying. And I would have thought that you would have gotten her to stop crying. So you must not be good at your job. And that's what he said. And I was so bewildered by what he said. It took me a moment to realize what he thought was that it's my job to make her to stop crying. And of course, that's not our job because this woman was married to this man for 50 years and she should cry. And that's okay for her to cry. And it's not a happy event. And, it's not my job to be a medical clown and tell her jokes and cheer her up. Right now, she just lost her husband to 50 years. And the reason I'm saying this story is We're not going to make the tragedy go away, but we're just looking for ways to cope and get through it better. So before we talk about ways to cope, I'm going to ask if everybody can mute themselves. If your microphone is not muted, please mute it. If we can mute that person. Great. Okay, so with coping skills, before I come and give ways for somebody to cope, I think it's more valuable for us to think for ourselves, what are ways or things that I can do for myself right now to help me get through this terrible time? Can I think of one or two or maybe three things that if I do those things, it's going to make me feel calmer, it's going to make me feel safer, it's going to make me feel at ease. Maybe what I need to do is share my feelings with my friend and call them on the phone. Maybe I want to write a Facebook post and write my feelings out and post it there. Maybe I want to listen to music. But we want to think for ourselves without anybody telling us what to do. What's something that I can do while I'm feeling these really difficult feelings? What could I do for myself to feel better? What can I do for myself to cope with the challenging feelings that I'm having and to get through the next difficult days? Okay. Now, if you're not sure of an idea of what you can do to cope, then I have a really interesting question for you. And the question is, was there ever a time in the past that you felt anxious or sad or afraid and you did something that helped you to feel better? Maybe 5 years ago, you were in a difficult situation. Maybe 5 years ago, you went through a divorce and you were very sad. Or maybe somebody mugged you and you were feeling afraid. Or maybe, your house burned down, or I don't know what. Something happened and it was difficult. And 5 years ago, you found something was helpful to you. So you can look back into your past and think about what was helpful to you in the past. What helped you then to cope? And you can come up with some of those ideas on your own and try them out and see if they're helpful to you to help you get through the next days a little bit easier. So here's a list of things that a lot of people I've spoken to over the years have found is helpful to them to cope. But again, it's best if you find your own ideas. If these are your own ideas, then that's wonderful. But we're not necessarily looking to tell people what to do. We want to invite the person to come up with ideas on their own that they perceive will be helpful to them. So just going through the list of things that are helpful, that people found helpful. To call a trusted friend and to share their feelings, to go for a walk, to listen to music. I wrote here to listen to music that you need to hear. The reason I wrote that is because I find with a lot of people that I've worked with, when you use music to cope, you can think about what type of music you need to hear, because music is expressive. Maybe to help you cope, you want to listen to sad music. Maybe to help you cope, you want to listen to happy music. You want to stand for a moment and think about what type of music would be helpful to you to listen to. Sometimes listening to sad music helps you to express your feelings. You find a sad song that puts the words in your mouth of the feelings that you're going through. Sometimes you need something to uplift you and to inspire you. And so that would be a different type of song. So when you pick music to use to cope, don't just pick any music. Think about what type of music you need to hear. Another thing on our list is to reduce media exposure. And this is really hard for us in 2022. We're plugged into Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. We're everywhere all the time. And we're getting videos and articles, posts about bad things that happened. And, after an event like this happens, there's going to be an investigation. And then there's going to be some sort of operation to catch the bad guys. There's going to be an investigation to see if the military handled it properly. And it's going to be in the news over and over and over. And what happens is when we expose ourselves to media, it wears us down. We're seeing traumatic things again and again and again. And that sometimes is really hard for us. And we are very attracted to the media We have curiosity. There's a lot of psychological reasons why we look at the news and why it's so interesting to us, but it does cause us trauma. And so I'm bringing to attention, when we're trying to cope with difficult feelings, one of the things we might want to do is reduce our exposure to the news. Maybe don't watch the news. Maybe watch it a lot less. Maybe appoint a good friend to just tell you what you need to hear and not anything more for the next few days because you need a break. And that's okay. Another thing on our list is to talk to a professional. The reason that's not the first thing on the list is only because what we're talking about today is psychological first aid. We're talking about normal feelings that people have after a very difficult situation. And that generally, these feelings tend to go away to some degree on their own, partially or entirely, and we can help ourselves without needing a psychologist. However, there's nothing wrong with speaking to a psychologist, and I encourage it if that's something that you want to do. And furthermore, if you try different ways of coping and it doesn't work, then I absolutely recommend that you should meet a psychologist, a social worker, a psychiatrist, a mental health professional that knows how to help you to feel better. Another thing is, we don't want to use drugs or alcohol to cope, right? Because that's a common thing that human beings do, is we'll drink a lot of alcohol, we'll get drunk, we'll get high. And there's a lot of reasons why that's not helpful. And it might be helpful in the short term, but it's not going to be helpful in the long term. So when we're talking about coping methods, we're talking about looking for healthy things that make us healthy people. They make us able to sustain the life that we're living. And we're not looking for coping mechanisms like drinking and getting drunk that's going to make things difficult for us in the long run. Okay. There's a really big topic that we have to go into, and that is the topic of creating safety. And by creating safety, what I mean is, a lot of us, after these events, we feel unsafe, and that's our symptom. We feel that we can't go to a shopping mall anymore. We can't go to church. We can't go to places of worship. We're afraid at any moment somebody's going to come in and kill us. And it may even be irrational. It might not even be logical. And we know that the chances of this happening are so small. We know that. We're not stupid. We know that these events don't happen every day, but still we feel unsafe. That happens to a lot of us. And so what we need to do in that scenario is we need to think about how to create a sense of safety. This might be something you want to do with a psychologist. There's a lot to say on this, but just to say a few words, similar to what we said before, you want to think about, what can I do to feel safer as I go outside? We don't want to avoid things that trigger us and cause us trauma. In other words, we want to avoid extra media exposure, because why do you have to watch the news 10,000 times a day? That's not necessary. But if we're afraid to go outside, and now we're not going to work, and now we're not going to church, and now we're not going to school, that can be a problem. And so those are things we don't want to avoid. And when we avoid going outside because we feel unsafe, it reinforces in us a sense that it's not safe, and it only compounds the problem and it makes it worse. And so we're looking for ways to create a sense of safety, to feel a little bit safer. And I'm not talking about feeling 100% safer. Maybe there's no technique that will instantly make you feel 100% safe right away. And if there is, let me know about it, because I need that tool as well. But maybe we can do something to help us feel 20% safer, 50% safer, and just safe enough that even though we feel a little bit apprehensive, we're willing to go out to school, to church, to work, and to do whatever we need to do. So we're thinking of things that we can do to make us feel safe. For each person, that might be different. Maybe it's thinking of a religious saying or bringing a religious item with you. Maybe it's having a conversation with a friend and thinking of a mantra or a saying or an idea that when you think of this idea, it helps you feel safe. Maybe it's bringing a photograph of your family with you everywhere you go. I don't know what will make you feel safe, but You can think about what helps you to feel safe. I'll give you an example. We have a lot of terror attacks where I live. And one of my children, I have 5 children, one of my children started to feel afraid of going to sleep at night by himself because he said he's afraid that at any moment gunmen are going to come into the house and kill him. And he didn't see a terror attack. He was never at one. He was never a victim of one. But he hears from his friends in school all the news and all the things that go on. And this is very frightening to him. And what we needed to do together was to create for my son a sense of safety. And so we had a conversation. What would help you to feel a little bit safer when you go to sleep at night? And one of the interesting things that we came up with was he's going to turn the light in the room on for a few minutes and lie down in his bed with the light on. And after a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, then he's ready to turn it off. And when he does that, that helps him to feel safer. And that's really interesting. And we can think about now why that makes him feel safer. How did he arrive at this idea? It's a really interesting discussion, but the fact is, this is something that helped him to feel safer. So again, we're talking about when we feel unsafe after a stampede and we don't want to go to crowded places, we don't want to go to the marketplace, we don't want to go to university, we don't want to go to school, or maybe we don't want to go to a place of worship or work. We want to think about what can we do to create a sense of safety. And I'll say a word on professional psychological help that a psychologist can be really helpful for this. Okay, we're moving with great progress and we're coming soon towards the end of the talk and we've learned a lot of good things. Let's finish up and learn some more things. So after traumatic events, like the ones we're talking about tonight, these events can cause us to be very tired, physically tired. And the reason for that can be we're not sleeping regularly, we're not eating regularly, we're having a lot of extra thoughts, which cause a lot of energy to be used in our body. Maybe we're doing a lot of planning, a lot of speaking to people on the phone. Maybe we just planned a funeral. Maybe we're helping to raise money for the victims. There are many reasons why we can be very tired after a traumatic event. And we can expect ourselves and judge ourselves to be functioning on the regular level that we're used to. And that might not be so realistic. It could be that it's okay to work a little bit slower than usual, to maybe not be as productive as usual. I think we have to be compassionate to ourselves, understanding to ourselves, and say, hey, this has been a hard week. We can take it a little bit easy. We need a little bit of strength. We need some time to eat, to drink, to rest, and that's okay. I was speaking to a woman, I think it was last year, and she got news that her brother went into cardiac arrest, and they were living in 2 different countries. So she was in one country, her brother was in another country, and somebody phoned her and told her on the phone, your brother basically just died, and they're doing CPR on him right now. You better pray. And she was in the middle of eating a meal at a fish restaurant. And she went right away. She left her food and she prayed. And she was so busy in her prayers and in helping the family that for 2 days she didn't eat almost anything, didn't drink almost anything, didn't sleep. She felt exhausted. She was dehydrated. And I'm not judging her and I'm not saying that that was a bad decision, but when we're in a difficult spot, when we hear difficult news, it is important to take care of ourselves. We're like a car. We need energy. We need fuel. So to eat, to drink, to take a break, and we might feel guilty. And one of the things that she said was, how could I finish my fish at the restaurant if my brother just died? And I was thinking of telling her, I'll tell you why you need to eat the fish, because you need a lot of strength for the next few days and you might not eat that much. I didn't say that to her because I didn't feel it was the right time, but it's important to take care of ourselves. So we said a lot of important ideas. what happens now if we meet somebody that we feel is in need of some help after these events? We heard that they're affected by the events, they're having a hard time. What could we do for them? So we can consider approaching them and asking if they want to talk. If they don't want to talk, well, we can't force them, right? But if they want to talk, then we can give them an opportunity to share with us whatever they want to share. And we don't know what they want to share, and we don't need to force them to tell their story. This is a big debate in the world of psychology. Some people think that if I meet somebody who's traumatized after these events, I have to make them tell me their story and tell me all the details and make them talk a lot. And that's a debate. It's not so clear that that's helpful. Maybe helpful. What I say is, if a person wants to share with you a 2-hour story and tell you all the details of how they're feeling and what happened to their family and how it's hard for them, and you have time to listen, then that's fine. But we don't want to force them to share. And if they share only a little bit, then that's okay too. And we want to listen to them non-judgmentally. We're not listening to them to immediately give them advice. Even if all we did was listen to somebody else and be there with them and be present with them and make them feel that they were heard and they were understood, you've done a huge thing. You've done a really big thing for them. I'm going to jump to this slide for a second. In this type of work, after tragedy, a lot of people think that you have to know all the answers and have magical words to tell people, right? Somebody just went through a divorce. Somebody's uncle died in the church shooting. What do I tell them? And the answer is, there's no magical words to tell them that will take away the pain. There's no magical words to make their uncle come back to life. It's not so much about words. It's more about listening to the other person and letting them feel that they were heard. That's a major component of this. So you don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to be a psychologist or specialist. You just need to be a listener, and that's a big deal. So again, we can approach the person, ask if they want to speak to us, and if they want to, we can listen to them non-judgmentally and really give them the time without giving any advice, just listening and letting them feel that they were heard. And then after we listen to them and we're sure that they're done sharing with us, we can ask them directly, is there anything that they would like from us at this time? Do they need help with anything? And they could say no, they could say yes. We don't know what they'll say. And that's what's really interesting. We're not going to know what they tell us until we ask them. I'll tell you a good story because stories help us. So I one time went to a case as a medic of a man who drowned in a ritual pool. In the country where I live, we have these pools all over where a person dips in the pool and they become pure. And this is a religious idea that people do here. And one time, a religious man, he dipped into this pool and we're not sure what happened to him. Maybe he had a seizure under the water, but whatever happened, he somehow drowned underneath the water. And it's a really shallow pool. It's very hard to understand how you can drown in such a pool, but he died. And we were resuscitating him, and his wife came on scene. And again, all the medics said, Avi, go talk to the wife, right? Because they always send me to do that. And I'm speaking to the man's wife, and I'm listening to her, and I said to her, is there anything I can do to be helpful to you right now? And I'm just asking, I don't know what she'll say. And she said the most surprising thing that I didn't expect. She said to me, I want you to go outside and find 20 school children and ask them to pray for my husband. She believed that if she found 20 school children to pray for her husband during the CPR, this can save his life. And that's what she needed right now. And I would never have guessed that in my life, that that's what she wanted. But when I asked her and she said that's what she wants, I arranged it for her. We went outside. It was a time of day where there's a lot of children outside, and there was a lot of children gathered around looking at the ambulances. They were standing there anyways. And so we started praying for 2 or 3 minutes for the husband. And then I went back in and I told her we arranged a prayer for your husband with the children. She said, I'm so grateful to you. That's so meaningful to me. Thank you so much. So you don't know what a person needs until you ask them. You really don't know. Now, in this conversation with this person, we said you can ask them, is there anything I can do for you at this time? They can say yes, they can say no. If it's reasonable, you can try to help them with that thing that they want. You can encourage them to connect to a psychologist or mental health professional if you think that that's what they need. And you can discuss together if they're interested in finding ways of coping. You can say to them, are you interested in us talking for a few minutes about finding ways to cope during this difficult time? They may say yes, they may say no, right? And if they say no, so no. And if they say yes, then we can say, great. Has there ever been a time when you went through some difficult things and you did something to find some relief? Or is there something that you can think of right now that might help you to feel a little bit better and get through this difficult situation for the next few days? And let's see what they say. If they come up with ideas on their own, fantastic. If they don't come up with ideas on their own and they need help, then we can try to help them. But we want to encourage people to do this on their own as much as possible. So we said, you don't have to have all the answers. There's no magical words to take away the pain. We want to listen to people much more than talking. We want them to feel that they were heard. Okay? There's a lot more things here. I'm just going to run quickly for a moment and check if there's anything else I want to focus on. Here's another thing. This is really important. Not everybody needs psychological first aid. We don't want to assume that everybody is broken and everybody's traumatized, and if they don't get our help, something bad will happen. I don't think that that's true scientifically. And you know, if somebody doesn't need help and we offer them help, it makes them feel uncomfortable, and it's not good, right? Did you ever see these videos sometimes in YouTube or TikTok where people do CPR on somebody who doesn't need CPR and they start waking up and getting you to go away? So we don't want to offer help and assume that everyone needs our help. What we're looking to do is we're paying attention, first of all, for ourselves. Maybe we need to do some of the things we discussed tonight for ourselves. But even in regards to other people, we want to keep our eyes open and notice if somebody needs the assistance. But it doesn't mean we're now walking into every school, assuming everybody has a hard time and just forcing them to talk. So we want to be wary of that. We want to remember that people are resilient and human beings go through a lot of tragedies and a lot of difficult things in life, and we're made of very tough stuff. Every country, every family, every nation has gone through a lot of difficulty, and we're very resilient, and we come back. Human beings come back, they bounce back from tragedy, and we want to remember that. Here's another really interesting idea, and I think this will be maybe the second to last thing that we're going to focus on, and we'll say one thing after that and we'll finish and take questions. I was once at a CPR where a woman seems to have died in her sleep, and from what happened, it looks like she had a seizure, and she had what I think they call here status epilepticus, which is where like the seizure keeps going and it doesn't stop. And nobody was home, and she died as a result of having this seizure going on and on and on. And it's a very tragic story, and I'm actually traumatized from it, so I'm not going to go into the details. But her children came home and they found the mother passed away, and it was very traumatic and sad for all of us present and for the family. And one of the sons of the deceased woman, a 16-year-old boy, came home from school. And he heard that his mother passed away. And this 16-year-old boy was sitting on the couch, and there was a person trying to help him. And how was he trying to help him? He was giving him a cup of water. And, you know, I think in each culture and country, people might do this differently, but a lot of times we as helpers want to feel that we're helpful to somebody going through a hard time, and we don't know what to do. And I found that in a lot of countries, in a lot of cases I worked with, people will give somebody else a glass of water. And it's not even because the person needs any water, it's because the helper needs to feel helpful. They feel helpless that they are a neighbor, they're a friend, and they don't know what to say and they don't know what to do. So they say, let me do something. I know what I'll do. I'm going to give a glass of water. And so I saw a neighbor of the 16-year-old boy give him a glass of water. Okay. I don't have to get involved in that, right? Not my problem, no problem. A few minutes later, the neighbor gave this boy a second glass of water. A few minutes later, he gave him a third glass of water, a fourth glass of water. Finally, we got to the fifth glass of water within like half an hour. And I carefully and gently took the neighbor aside and I said, you know, most people don't drink 5 glasses of water in half an hour. Even if they ran a marathon, you don't drink that much water in a row. Maybe you're doing this because you feel helpless and you don't know what to do for your neighbor. And so you're just trying to be helpful. But maybe it's okay to just sit next to him. You don't have to do anything. Maybe just be there with him. Just sit next to him. Give him his space. Give him his distance. And let him feel that he's not alone. You don't need water. You don't need fancy words. Be present with him. And that itself is a major thing that you can do. And this was a novel idea to the person I told it to, and that's what they did. But our presence really matters. And that's why I wanted to emphasize that. You don't need fancy words. You don't need to be a brilliant psychologist. Just be there with the person. And it already does so much. I can speak about that for a long time. How does that work? And why is that true? But it's one of the most powerful things we can do is just be there with somebody else. And finally, the last thing I want to emphasize on tonight is social support. You know, we started the beginning of this talk saying that we are gathered here together in this Zoom. And whenever human beings come together, we can share our pain together and we can grow together. We can share techniques for coping together. If it's hard for you, you can tell me your feelings and I can listen to you and help you feel validated. There are so many things that we can do together that we can't so much do by ourselves. We can do these things to ourselves by ourselves a little bit, but ideally, we really need other people to grow and go through hard times. And so whether it's 2 friends going out for coffee or tea, whether it's making a phone call to somebody else and just chatting and sharing your feelings, maybe you don't feel anything, but you want to check on somebody that you think is having a hard time. And you just say, hey, I love you. I just wanted to see if everything's okay. How are you doing? And create an opportunity for them to share. Maybe they will share, maybe they won't share. We grow as a people. And I encourage you, and I encourage anybody that watches this and any community that has tragedy to create social opportunities to get together, to talk together, to process together. There's so many interesting stories and studies on this. I'll tell you one really interesting one just to bring out the example. They found in psychological studies that soldiers who go to war, they're very traumatized, right? They see death, they kill people, their comrades get killed. They get into some very difficult situations. And they have a lot of trauma to unpack and to share with one another after a war. And depending on how you drive the soldier back home, if you just throw him on a plane and fly him home by himself on the first plane, he has no group to share this with. But if you put him in a truck or on a flight with other soldiers, now they're sharing war stories. They're talking together about the friend that they lost. They're talking about the scary battle that they were in. You've created a social opportunity for interactions where we could talk, we could share, we can tell our stories. It's so powerful. It's one of the most amazing tools that we have, and everybody in every country has other people. So to utilize them. You'll get these slides if you want them, and we have some more things here about grief, might be interesting to you. And on my YouTube channel and in this article here, I have another talk on grief. But I think we covered a lot of really important things tonight. If you want to learn more from other videos that I made, so you can check out the other videos on the YouTube channel, you can find the link here. But I think that we really covered a lot of really important topics tonight. And my heart goes out to the families and to the communities that went through these terrible situations. And I'm grateful that all of us got together tonight to talk about them and learn new things that could be helpful to us in the future. Thank you, everybody. If anybody has any questions, you want to write it in the chat box. This could be a great time for questions. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. Any questions? And if you have a question after this, you can email it to me, you can WhatsApp me, I'm happy to answer. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. I'm seeing the comments in the chat. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again to ERA for being behind this and getting this out. It's so important. And again, support them in their work. They're amazing. They're doing incredible things. I hope these ideas were helpful. And I wish everybody only the best of news. Everybody should be well and safe, and we should hear good things. Have a good night. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please, you can send it to the chat so that Avi can answer. Apart from that, we'll also be sending you, everyone, the recording of this conversation and also the presentation from Avi via your email since you've registered. If you have any questions, even after that, you can also relay the questions to us. You can always reach out to us. In the meantime, while Avi is waiting for questions from everyone, I would also encourage everyone to download. I know I mentioned this earlier, but it was brief before Avi came up. The application is signaled by error. What the application does is that by the click of a button, you can reach out to us. And, that can help, of course, so where you can receive care from our dispatchers, our paramedics, our health professionals. Thank you very much for your time so far. Please, you can drop your questions in the chat box so that Abby can answer. If you have, what do you do if someone clearly needs support but rejects your offer repeatedly? Okay, so I'll be handing the microphone back to Abby to take it up from there. Thank you very much.
I see there's one question in the chat. It's a great question, so I'm just going to take a minute to answer it. The question is, what do you do if somebody clearly needs support but rejects your offer? You see they're having a hard time, they're not doing well. You approach them, you did it in the right place at the right time, and it didn't work out. I'll just add on that. Sometimes we approach people in front of others and it's embarrassing. We have to have good timing. We have to find the right time and place. You know, you don't want to approach them in front of their friends and things like this. But what do? You know, there's really not a lot we can do in that scenario. The best I think we can do is we can let them know that we're available if they ever want to talk, and we can let them know how to find us. So let's say it's somebody that I know, I can say, I understand, that's okay that you don't want to talk. If you ever do want to talk, please don't hesitate to call me, and I'm always there for you. So you could say something like that. If it's somebody that we don't know and we feel comfortable, we can leave them our phone number. Maybe we know an organization that they provide some sort of psychological first aid telephonically on the phone, and we can leave them that number, and we can say, it's okay that you don't want to talk now. In case you ever do want to talk about these things, this could be a phone number that might be helpful to you. And what you're doing is you're leaving with them a resource that they can follow up later on. But at the end of the day, they either will follow up or they won't follow up. If somebody is in danger, so then we have different rules. There are some laws in different countries where you can force a person to get help. But if they're not in danger, there's not a lot you can do. I think as a psychotherapist, there's a lot of wisdom in knowing how to motivate somebody to want to get help. Sometimes if they're not motivated to get help, we can think of a creative way to get them to want to be helped. We can think of the right person to influence them. But pretty much those are my comments on that. But yeah, not everyone is going to want help, and we'll try to do our best in that way. I see another question here. Practically speaking, I'm reading this question from the chat. Practically speaking, one may forget some of the tips of psychological first aid. What would you say is the very basic principle that applies in all situations? This is a fantastic question. I love this question. I actually teach psychological first aid in a 2-day course. There's a lot of things. But if you boil it down to 3 words, the World Health Organization boils it down to 3 words. And I know that you know what the World Health Organization is, and they actually have a manual on psychological first aid. You can download it in many languages. And the 3 words are look, listen, and link. And what they mean is look at the person and at the situation and try to understand what are their needs. Listen. Approach the person and listen to what they tell you they need, right? Don't just assume by looking. Now ask them and listen to what they say. And then link means connect them to the resources that could be helpful to them. Connecting them to a charity organization, connecting them to a religious figure, connecting them to a psychologist, and so on. So I'm going to write that in the chat box. Look, listen, link. Perfect. Thank you. I saw that you wrote it for me. Thank you. Okay, of the World Health Organization. In fact, if I can, I will try to also send the organizers a PDF from the World Health Organization about what does listen and link. It's really a nice thing. So thank you for that question. Fantastic question. Anything else?
Yes, I think Emmanuel Banjo is raising their hand. So yeah, Emmanuel, you can go ahead if you want to speak. I think this will be the last question so that we can end the meeting.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Harvey, and a big thanks to the organizers of this wonderful class. I quickly want to ask that, like in Nigeria, for example, whereby you have the disaster scenes and then everybody wants to help the bystanders get there before you as a paramedics, and they are trying to help or they have been helping before. How do you get to approach the victims? How do you approach them? How do you talk to them that, okay, I'm here to help you? How do you go about it? How do you start? So that's my question, basically. Thank you, sir.
So Emmanuel, thank you for the question. Just to clarify, are you asking, how do I approach the wounded person, for example? What are the first words that I tell them to explain why I'm there? Is that part of your question?
Not the wounded. Now, the
bystanders?
Yes, like for example, now I have someone who is involved in a collapsed building. So now, how do you relate or the person? Like the family of the victim,
I see. So the family of the victim. Fantastic question. Again, I think that you can give them psychological first aid. And again, we can talk for days about this. Maybe one day I'll visit you in your beautiful country and we'll talk about it. But, every situation as a medic is different, because sometimes you're driving the ambulance and you can only talk to somebody for 1 minute and things are urgent. And sometimes somebody took the patient to the hospital and you can stay on scene for 2 hours if you want to. And so there are situations where you can do psychological first aid with the bystanders and the family and the victim's family. You could help them for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and we'll talk about how. And sometimes you only have 1 minute to do something. I'll give you an example of a 1 minute intervention, and then we'll answer your question about what do you say to the family if you have more than 1 minute. Sometimes, even if I'm treating a patient, I'm going to try to tell them things that, if they're able to hear, can be encouraging to them. It can give them strength and hope. I remember a story where there was a woman who gave birth here where I live, and she had postpartum depression, right? A woman who gets depression after she gives birth. And she one day hung herself in her house. She tried to take her life and to hang herself. And she was not successful, and she was actually okay because her carotid artery, she pressed the rope on one side, but the other side, the oxygen kept flowing for some reason, the way she tied it. And so she was semi-conscious, but she was alive, and I don't think she had any neurological damage, physical injury. So when the medics came, they took her down. We took the rope off her neck. We didn't even need to do CPR. We gave her oxygen. She started coming back to herself. And we were going to transport her to the hospital, obviously, and to get psychiatric care for this. And the husband comes home because somebody just took him from work and said, hey, your wife hung herself, go home. So he rushes in, and we're about to transport the woman to the hospital. And he is about to go in the ambulance with his wife. And I was not the ambulance driver. I was a first responder that came with my own vehicle. And I said to the husband, you are about to go on the ambulance in 1 minute. Is there anything until then that I can do to help you? And he said, yes, I have 2 children here that need to go to school. Put them by the neighbors and have them call me. And that's what I did, okay? Because when a person is going through a crisis, there are a lot of needs. There's a lot of things that are happening. There's a ton of busyness. And he has to think now about if his wife is okay, and who he has to call and inform. And he has to decide with the ambulance driver which hospital to go to. And there's just so much going on. And he's got children. Well, he's just going to leave his children at home? No, somebody has to watch them. So even in 1 minute, you can approach a person who's able to listen to you and say, is there anything I can do to help you right now? And literally just asking that question can be really, really helpful. And they may tell you something that you can do. And so I took these children, I knocked on the neighbor's door, and I said, the neighbors had to leave. They asked if you can watch their children and give them a call. And that's what I did. So that's just a 1 minute intervention. And that's part of psychological first aid, because part of psychological first aid is practical help. So I'm grateful you asked this question. Even if you do practical help, that's part of helping a person cope, because you've solved some of the needs that they have at this difficult time. Now, let's talk about if you have more than 1 minute. You're still going to want to do psychological first aid with a family if you have an hour, you have half an hour, and the steps are going to be the same. We can talk about look, listen, and think. That's a very broad model. There's models of psychological first aid in the presentation that I sent, which have 8 steps, not just 3, and it spells it out for you a little bit better. But, essentially, again, what we're basically doing, if I had to boil this down, Emmanuel, and a short answer is, we want to look and see what does the family need. That's look, right? So sometimes there's blood all over the floor because grandpa fell down and hit his head and there's blood. Sometimes we just did a CPR and there's medical packages of equipment and stuff that we just opened up all over the floor. So we know that that's a need to clean that up. We don't want the family to clean that up. Sometimes we see that the parents just left and there's all these children by themselves and we want to find somebody to watch them. And so you're just looking at the scene and thinking, what do I think they need here? I'll tell you a story. And I know we're going really late. I have to go soon and I see there's one last question. So I'll try to speed this up because Emmanuel's question is amazing. I'll go back to the chat and then we'll finish. There was a case in my neighborhood with a little boy that drowned in a bucket a few years ago. And both parents went in the ambulance with the boy to the hospital, and they left 10 kids all by themselves at home. and it was during a holiday. And there's no way during this holiday for us to bring their family to watch them, because it was a religious holiday and we weren't allowed to use electricity, and we're not allowed to call their cousins or uncles or aunts to come. And so you have all these children by themselves. The parents are in the hospital. So we said, what can we do? We said, I have an idea. Let's bring their rabbi, their spiritual leader that they look up to. Let's bring him as a father figure to be with the children. And we did that. And he came and he gave out candies to the children, and he told them stories, and he gave them a lot of hope, and he entertained them. And in the meanwhile, we tried to think of how to bring family members there in a way that we could. And so that's the idea of look. You're looking at a situation and anticipating with your mind, what do they need based on what you see in front of you. And then listen is we approach the person and ask what they need, listen to what they answer us, and try to connect them with those resources. And then link is to carry that through. They need money because their husband just died. And the first thing they're thinking of is, how are we going to eat? We have no food. We're poor. What are we going to do? Oh, let me connect you to this organization that can help you with that. Maybe there's some sort of aid organization. And that's link. You're giving them the phone number, you're making them the connection, and you're connecting them in a way to what they need. I see one last question. I'll spend 1 minute on it and we'll finish. On link, sometimes the person, I'm reading the chat, sometimes the person you are trying to help by linking them may think that you're judgmental, thinking they're crazy. This is a great question in the chat, that you think somebody needs psychological support, but they feel stigmatized. They feel that you're judging them and you think they're crazy. What do you do? There's a lot to say about that. I can't go too into it. We can talk in private about it. But if I could, I would try to give them an example or a parable of, just like there's physical injury, so too there's this type of injury as well. I would try to think of a way that the message can come in. And I would try to give them the message that they're not broken, they're not crazy, but this is how people show up after the situation. And it's often really helpful to speak to somebody that knows about these situations. I would try to find a way to deliver the message. Thank you, everybody, very much, and have a good night. Be well, be safe, and thank you for your great questions.
Thank you very much, Avi. We really had very good time here. Not just that it was very educative, it was also very relatable and it was fun. Thank you very much, everyone that joined. Just like we mentioned earlier, if you have more questions, you can send to us via our email. That's contact@emergencyresponseafrica.com. We will send all questions to Avi and Avi will reply. We will also send you the content of today's lecture and every other document that needs to be sent to you. If there are no further comments, there shouldn't be any further comments for now. Thank you very much for joining. I'm sure you had a very good time. Thank you very much, Avi, for gracing your presence with our space. We're very excited and we hope that there will be more sessions like this in the future. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll be ending the call now and we'll be sending every content that is needed to be sent to everyone later. Have a wonderful evening for those that are, of course, everywhere you are, if it's in the evening, and have a wonderful afternoon or morning for wherever you're joining us from. Thank you very much.